Wu Jin, the man who commands the shadows of Los Angeles, froze as he watched a waitress named Margaret battle a freezing downpour with his disabled mother clinging to her back. He instantly rushed over, his matte black Range Rover skidding to a halt as the headlights sliced through the silver sheets of rain. Moments ago, he had been at a mahogany table with his hand on a hidden gun, ready to paint a boardroom red, until a medical alert on his wrist turned his blood to ice. He didn't find the assassins he expected. Instead, he found Margaret, her uniform plastered to her skin and her name tag glinting under the flickering streetlights. She was struggling toward the distant glow of the emergency room, her boots slipping on the slick pavement while 72-year-old Parkinson hung onto her for dear life. His mother's wheelchair sat 3 blocks back, a mangled skeleton on a broken sidewalk. Wu Jin, a man who believed every human soul had a price tag, stood paralyzed. For the first time, he wasn't looking at a transaction, he was looking at a miracle. A stranger was risking her life to save his mother for absolutely nothing. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 200 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. Wu Jin's hand was already on the gun under the table when his wrist started buzzing. The vibration cut through the tension in the room like a scream. Every man at that mahogany table knew what happened when Wu Jin got interrupted during negotiations. Someone usually ended up in a body bag. But when he looked down at the glowing screen, his face went white. Mother, cardiac alert, GPS active. He was out the door before anyone could speak. His men would handle the rest. Right now, the only thing that mattered was the blinking red on his phone, 3 miles away in the freezing rain. His mother's nursing home had one job: keep her safe. If they failed, he would burn the building to the ground with everyone inside. The Range Rover's tires screamed as he took a corner too fast. Rain hammered the windshield so hard he could barely see the road. His mother had aphasia. She couldn't speak, couldn't call for help, couldn't tell anyone she was scared. The nursing home had promised him 24-hour monitoring, the best care money could buy. He paid them $15,000 a month. And now she was out there, alone, in a storm that could kill her. The GPS led him to a broken sidewalk near the highway. Her wheelchair sat in the middle of the street, crushed and twisted like someone had thrown it off a truck. His heart stopped. Where was she? He threw the car into park and ran into the rain, scanning the darkness for any sign of her. That's when he saw them. A woman in a diner uniform was carrying his mother on her back. She was young, maybe mid-20s, and soaking wet. Her name tag said Margaret in faded letters. She was climbing the hill toward the hospital, her boots slipping on the wet pavement with every step. His mother's arms were wrapped around the stranger's neck, clinging to her like a child. Margaret's legs were shaking. She looked like she was about to collapse. But she didn't stop moving. Wu Jin ran toward them, his expensive shoes splashing through puddles. Stop! Put her down. Margaret turned, her eyes wide with exhaustion. Are you family? I'm her son. His voice came out sharper than he meant. What happened? Where did you find her? She was sitting in the rain by the bus stop, Margaret said, breathing hard. Her wheelchair was already broken. I waited for someone to help, but no one stopped. So I picked her up. Wu Jin stared at her. This stranger had lifted a 72-year-old woman onto her back and carried her through a storm. She had ruined her uniform, risked her own safety, and walked 3 blocks in freezing rain, for a person she didn't even know. He didn't understand. People didn't do things like this. Not without a reason. Not without wanting something. He pulled out his wallet and counted $500 bills. Here. For your trouble. Margaret looked at the money like it was poison. I don't want your money. Everyone wants money. He pushed the bills toward her. Take it. Her jaw tightened. You think that fixes this? You think throwing cash at me makes up for the fact that your mother was abandoned in a storm? The words hit him like a punch to the stomach. He had no answer. Because she was right. He had paid the nursing home a fortune, and they had let his mother wander out into the rain like garbage. All his money, all his power, it hadn't kept her safe. Just be a better son, Margaret said quietly. That's all she needs. She turned and kept walking toward the hospital, his mother still clinging to her back. Wu Jin stood frozen in the rain, watching them disappear into the light of the emergency room doors. His mother's face was pressed against Margaret's shoulder. And for the first time in years, she looked peaceful. He had seen his mother cry. He had seen her scream in frustration when the words wouldn't come out of her mouth. But he had never seen her hold onto someone the way she was holding onto this stranger. It was the kind of trust he thought she had lost forever. His chest felt tight. His throat burned. He wanted to follow them inside, but his feet wouldn't move. Because for the first time in his life, Wu Jin realized something terrifying. His money couldn't buy what Margaret had just given his mother for free. And that made him feel like the smallest, most worthless man in the world. Wu Jin finally moved. He pushed through the emergency room doors and found Margaret in the waiting area, still soaking wet. His mother was on a gurney, wrapped in heated blankets. A nurse was checking her vitals. Margaret stood beside her, holding his mother's hand like she had known her for years. When his mother saw him, she didn't reach out. She just stared at him with eyes that looked more tired than relieved. "Where's the nursing home supervisor?" Wu Jin asked the nurse. "On their way," she said, not looking up from her clipboard. 20 minutes later, a man in a cheap suit walked in, smiling like nothing was wrong. His name tag read David Chen, Director of Operations. Wu Jin's hands curled into fists. This man had one job: protect his mother. And he had failed. "Mr. Park, I'm so glad she's safe," David said, reaching out for a handshake. Wu Jin didn't take it. "How did she get out?" David's smile faltered. "We're still investigating." "Investigating?" Wu Jin's voice dropped to a whisper. The kind of whisper that made grown men sweat. "I pay you $15,000 a month. You have cameras. You have locked doors. You have staff on every floor. So tell me, how does a 72-year-old woman in a wheelchair end up 3 miles away in a storm?" David's face went pale. There was a shift change. Someone must have. Must have what? Wu Jin stepped closer. Forgotten she exists. Decided she wasn't worth checking on. Margaret was watching now. Wu Jin could feel her eyes on him. He didn't care. This man had put his mother in danger, and someone needed to pay for that. David opened his mouth to respond, but Wu Jin cut him off. "You're going to shut down that facility," Wu Jin said. "Tonight. You're going to refund every family you've lied to. And if I ever hear your name again, I'll make sure you never work in this city." David's voice cracked. "You can't." "I can." Wu Jin pulled out his phone. "I have 3 lawyers on speed dial and enough money to bury you in lawsuits until you're selling everything you own just to eat. Do we understand each other?" David nodded, his hand shaking. He turned and practically ran out of the hospital. Wu Jin exhaled slowly. His chest still felt tight. His mother was safe now, but the image of her sitting alone in the rain wouldn't leave his mind. What if Margaret hadn't been there? What if no one had stopped? That's how you handle things. Margaret's voice came from behind him. Threats and fear. He turned. She wasn't backing down. Her arms were crossed, and her jaw was set like she was ready for a fight. Most people didn't talk to him this way. Most people knew better. "That man almost killed my mother," Wu Jin said. "I know," Margaret said. "But acting like a gangster in a hospital won't change what happened." The word gangster hit him like a slap. He wanted to argue, to tell her she didn't understand his world. But the truth was, she was right. He had spent years building a reputation as someone people feared. And now, standing in front of this waitress who had carried his mother through a storm, he realized how ugly that reputation looked. "My mom died in a place like this," Margaret said quietly. Same excuses. Same fake apologies. I was 16. I came to visit her one day, and she was gone. Heart attack. But the real cause? They didn't check on her. They didn't care. Because she was poor, and poor people don't matter to places like that. Wu Jin's throat burned. He didn't know what to say. Margaret's eyes were wet, but she didn't cry. She just stared at him like she was daring him to prove he was different. "I'm sorry," he said. The words felt strange in his mouth. "Don't apologize to me," Margaret said. "Apologize to her." She nodded toward his mother, who was watching them both from the gurney. "She's the one who deserves better." Wu Jin walked over and sat beside his mother. He took her hand. It was cold and fragile. She looked at him with those same tired eyes, and he realized something that made his stomach twist. She didn't trust him anymore. His money hadn't kept her safe. His power hadn't protected her. And now, the only person she felt safe with was a stranger. "I need your help," Wu Jin said, turning back to Margaret. "I want to hire you." Margaret blinked. "For what?" "To take care of my mother. At my house. Full time." He pulled out his wallet again, but she held up her hand. "I don't want your money," she said. "Then what do you want?" She looked at his mother, then back at him. "I want you to actually be there. Not just throwing money at the problem. If I take this job, you don't get to disappear. You show up. You learn how to take care of her. Deal?" Wu Jin's pride screamed at him to say no. But his mother squeezed his hand, weak, barely there, and he knew he didn't have a choice. "Deal," he said. Margaret nodded. "Then we start tomorrow." Margaret moved into the guest house behind Wu Jin's mansion the next morning. She didn't ask about the armed guards at the gate or the cameras watching every corner of the property. She just unpacked her single suitcase and got to work. For 3 weeks, she transformed his mother's life. She learned the way my son liked her tea. She played old Korean songs on her phone. She brushed her hair every night before bed. And slowly, his mother started smiling again. Wu Jin watched from a distance, pretending he wasn't paying attention. But he saw everything. The way Margaret laughed at his mother's attempts to hum along to the music. The way she never treated her like a burden. And the way his mother's eyes lit up whenever Margaret walked into the room. It was the kind of care no amount of money could buy. And it made Wu Jin's chest ache in a way he didn't understand. One evening, he found Margaret sitting on the back porch, staring at the city lights below. She looked exhausted. Her hands were shaking slightly as she held a cup of coffee. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. So he just stood there like an idiot until she noticed him. "You ever take a break?" he asked. "Not really," she said, not looking at him. "Breaks cost money. You're not working at the diner anymore. You don't have to." "I know." She finally turned to face him. "But sitting still makes me think too much. And I don't like where my thoughts go." Wu Jin understood that better than she knew. He spent most of his life running from the same thing. The voice in his head that reminded him what he really was. A criminal. A man who inherited violence and called it duty. But standing here, watching Margaret stare at the city like she was searching for something she'd never find, he realized they weren't so different. "Let me take you to dinner," he said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Like a date?" "Like two people who need to get out of this house before they lose their minds." She smiled, and it hit him harder than he expected. "Okay. But nowhere fancy. I don't do fancy." The next night, Wu Jin picked her up in a Tesla instead of the Range Rover. He thought it made him look less like a mobster. Margaret laughed when she saw it. "You think this is better," she said, climbing into the passenger seat. "You still look like you're about to close a drug deal." "I don't do drugs," Wu Jin said, starting the engine. "Right. You just threaten hospital administrators and have armed guards at your house for fun." He didn't respond. Because what could he say? She wasn't wrong. They ended up at a small Thai restaurant in Koreatown. The kind of place with plastic chairs and a menu written in 3 languages. Wu Jin felt completely out of place. He was used to private rooms and menus without prices. Here, people stared at him like he didn't belong. And maybe he didn't. Margaret ordered for both of them without asking. When the food came, she ate like she hadn't seen a meal in days. Wu Jin just watched, his own plate untouched. He didn't know how to do this, how to sit across from someone and pretend he was normal. "You going to eat, or just stare at me all night?" Margaret asked, her mouth half full. "I need to tell you something," Wu Jin said. Her fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "That sounds bad." "My father was murdered when I was 23, he said. The words came out flat, emotionless. Like he was reading from a script. He ran an organization. Not a business. An organization. The kind that doesn't show up on tax forms. When he died, I inherited it. The whole thing. The territory. The debts. The enemies. I didn't want it. But I took it because walking away meant every person who worked for my father would have been killed. So I became him." Margaret put down her fork. Her face didn't change. No shock. No fear. Just steady, unblinking attention. And that scared him more than anything, because it meant she was really listening. My neighborhood in Englewood had 13 gangs when I was growing up, she said quietly. I watched 3 of my friends get shot before I turned 16. I know what that world looks like. I know what it costs. Wu Jin's hands tightened around his glass. Then you know why I can't just walk away. People depend on me. People depended on those gang leaders too, Margaret said. And you know what happened? They all died. Or went to prison. Or lost everyone they loved. That's not duty. That's a cage. Her words hit him like bullets. Because she was right. He had spent years pretending he was protecting people, but really, he was just afraid. Afraid of being weak. Afraid of letting his father's empire crumble. Afraid of admitting that maybe, just maybe, he wanted a life that didn't involve blood and fear. Life's too short to be someone you hate, Margaret said, reaching across the table. Her fingers brushed his knuckles, and the touch sent a shock through his entire body. Trust me. I've wasted enough time hating myself. Don't do the same. Wu Jin looked down at her hand on his. Small. Scarred from years of hard work. But steady. Unshakable. And in that moment, he realized something terrifying. He wanted to be the kind of man who deserved to hold that hand in public. Without looking over his shoulder. Without wondering if she'd be used against him. I'll clean it up, he said, his voice cracking. The organization. I'll remove the worst parts. The violence. The fear. I'll make it something I don't have to hide from you. Margaret's grip tightened. You better mean that. I do. They sat there in silence, hands still touching across the table. And for the first time in years, Wu Jin felt something that terrified him more than any enemy ever could, hope. They didn't let go of each other's hands when they left the restaurant. Wu Jin drove them through the city, past the glowing towers and endless traffic, until they reached the dark, winding roads of Griffith Park. Margaret didn't ask where they were going. She just watched the city lights fade behind them as they climbed higher into the hills. He parked at a trail most people didn't know existed. No street lights. No cameras. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the distant hum of Los Angeles below. Margaret followed him up the narrow path, her sneakers crunching against the gravel. After 10 minutes, they reached a clearing that overlooked the entire city, a sea of light stretching to the ocean. This is the only place I can breathe, Wu Jin said, his voice barely above a whisper. No one knows I come here. Not my men. Not my enemies. Just me. Margaret stood beside him, staring at the view. Why bring me, then? Because I don't want to be alone anymore. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. Wu Jin had never said anything like that out loud. He had spent his entire life building walls, convincing himself that loneliness was strength. But standing here with Margaret, he realized how tired he was of pretending. She turned to face him. You said you'd clean up the organization. You meant that. I've already started. He pulled off his jacket and turned his back to her. The moonlight caught the ink that covered his shoulders, a massive black dragon, coiled and snarling, its claws digging into his skin. My father had this done when I turned 18. He said it was supposed to remind me that I carried the family's burden. That I was born to protect something bigger than myself. Margaret reached out slowly, her fingers tracing the dragon's scales. Her touch was gentle, almost careful, like she was afraid the ink might burn her. This isn't a burden, she said quietly. This is the armor of a man who cares too much. Wu Jin's breath caught in his chest. No one had ever said anything like that to him. Most people saw the tattoo and assumed he was dangerous. A threat. A monster. But Margaret saw something else, something he had buried so deep he almost forgot it existed. He turned to face her, and before he could stop himself, he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It was the kind of kiss that happened when two people had been holding back for too long. Margaret's hands gripped his shirt, pulling him closer, and Wu Jin felt something inside him crack open, something he didn't know how to name. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about enemies or empires or blood. He was just here. With her. And it felt like the beginning of something he didn't deserve but couldn't let go of. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret's forehead rested against his. Her breathing was uneven, and her hands were still tangled in his shirt. "You're really going to do this? Walk away from that life?" "I'm going to try." His voice cracked. "I don't know if I can. But I'm going to try." She nodded, and they stood there in silence, the city glowing below them like a promise neither of them knew how to keep. Over the next 2 weeks, Wu Jin worked in secret. He met with his accountants in the dead of night, transferring millions of dollars out of illegal operations and into legitimate businesses, community centers, scholarships, housing projects. He started selling off properties tied to the syndicate and cutting ties with the most violent members of his organization. It was slow, dangerous, and every move he made put a target on his back. But he didn't care. Because every time he came home and saw Margaret sitting with his mother, laughing at something silly on TV, he remembered why he was doing this. He wanted a life where he didn't have to look over his shoulder. A life where he could walk down the street with Margaret without wondering if someone was going to put a bullet in her head to get to him. But the more he tried to pull away from his old world, the more he realized how deep the roots went. One night, Margaret came home late from running errands. Wu Jin was waiting in the kitchen, pacing like a caged animal. The second she walked through the door, he grabbed her shoulders. "Where were you?" His voice was sharp, almost panicked. "At the grocery store," she said, confused. "Why? What's wrong? Did anyone follow you?" "Follow me? No." "Wu Jin, what's going on?" He didn't answer. Because the truth was, he had seen the black SUV parked across the street for the last 3 days. The same SUV that followed Margaret's bus route to the store. The same SUV that disappeared every time he got close. Someone was watching her. And that meant someone knew she mattered to him. "Nothing," he lied, releasing her shoulders. "Just be careful. Okay." Margaret frowned, but she didn't push. She just nodded and walked upstairs. Wu Jin stood alone in the kitchen, his hands trembling. He had spent years convincing himself that he could protect the people he loved through fear and power. But now, staring at the dark street outside, he realized the truth. His world was already closing in. And the only way to keep Margaret safe was to burn it all down before it burned her first. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that the real threat wasn't waiting outside. It was already growing inside Margaret's body, silent and unstoppable, counting down the days until it stole everything he was fighting for. Margaret's headaches started 3 weeks after their first kiss. Small at first, just a dull ache behind her eyes that she blamed on lack of sleep. But then they got worse. Sharp. Blinding. The kind of pain that made her grip the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned white. She told Wu Jin it was nothing. Just stress. Too much time staring at screens. He believed her because he wanted to. But when her vision blurred during dinner one night, when the entire room tilted sideways and she had to excuse herself to the bathroom to vomit, she knew something was very, very wrong. She went to a free clinic the next morning while Wu Jin was at a meeting. She didn't tell him. Didn't want him to worry. Didn't want him to see her as weak. The doctor was young, tired-looking, and spoke in the flat, emotionless tone of someone who had delivered bad news too many times. "We'll need to do an MRI," he said, staring at her chart. "But based on your symptoms, I'm concerned about a mass in your brain." Margaret's hands went numb. "A mass? A tumor? We won't know for sure until we run tests. But you need to come back tomorrow." She didn't remember leaving the clinic. Didn't remember the bus ride home. All she could think about was the word tumor echoing in her skull like a death sentence. The MRI confirmed it 2 days later. Stage 4 glioblastoma. Inoperable. 6 months. Maybe less. The doctor spoke about treatment options, radiation, chemotherapy, clinical trials, but Margaret stopped listening. Because none of it mattered. The cancer had already spread too far. The best they could do was buy her a few extra weeks of pain. And for what? So she could waste away in a hospital bed while Wu Jin watched her die. She walked out of that office and sat in her car for an hour, staring at nothing. Her phone buzzed. A text from Wu Jin. "Dinner tonight? I have something to show you." She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the phone out the window and drive until she ran out of gas. But instead, she texted back, "Sounds good." That night, Wu Jin took her to the pier. He seemed nervous, fidgeting with his jacket pocket like he was hiding something. Margaret's head throbbed, but she forced a smile. Forced herself to be present. Because if these were her last months, she didn't want to spend them drowning in self-pity. "Are you okay?" Woo Jin asked, his eyes searching her face. "You seem distant." "I'm fine," she lied. "Just tired." He didn't look convinced, but he didn't push. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black box. Margaret's breath caught. "No. Not now. Not like this." "I know this is fast," Woo Jin said, his voice shaking. "But I don't care. I've spent my whole life waiting for permission to be happy. I'm done waiting." He opened the box, revealing a diamond ring that probably cost more than her entire life savings. "Marry me." Margaret's vision blurred, but this time it wasn't the tumor. It was tears. Because this was the cruelest joke the universe could play. She had finally found someone who saw her, not as a waitress, not as a charity case, but as someone worth fighting for. And now she was dying. "Yes," she whispered, because saying no would hurt him more than the truth. Woo Jin slipped the ring onto her finger, and for a moment, she let herself believe it. Let herself imagine a wedding. A future. Growing old together. But the fantasy shattered the second she felt the familiar throb behind her eyes. She started recording video letters that night. Sitting alone in the guest house, her phone propped up on the dresser, tears streaming down her face as she spoke to the camera. "Woo Jin, if you're watching this, it means I'm gone. And I need you to know, I didn't tell you because I was afraid. Afraid you'd go back to being the man you were before. Afraid you'd burn the world down trying to save me. Don't do that. Please. Just live. Be happy. That's all I ever wanted for you." Her voice broke on the last word, and she had to stop the recording before she completely fell apart. The next week, Woo Jin dragged her to a bridal shop. He was so excited, talking about venues and guest lists like they had all the time in the world. Margaret tried on dresses, each one more beautiful than the last. And for a few minutes, just a few, she let herself feel happy. Let herself imagine walking down an aisle toward him. But then she caught her reflection in the mirror and saw how pale she looked. How thin. How dying. She didn't know that outside the bridal shop, a black SUV was parked across the street. Didn't know that the men inside had followed her to the oncology clinic. Didn't know they were taking pictures, building a file, preparing to use her illness as leverage against Woo Jin. And Woo Jin? He thought her exhaustion was just stress. Thought her secrecy was her way of pulling away because his world was too dangerous. So he worked harder. Sold off more properties. Cut more ties. All while the clock inside Margaret's skull ticked down to 0. Love had finally found them both. And it was already too late. Woo Jin was in a meeting with his lawyers when the video arrived. His phone buzzed once, then twice, then wouldn't stop. He pulled it out, expecting another update on the property transfers. Instead, he saw a message from an unknown number. No words. Just a video file. His stomach dropped before he even pressed play. The footage was grainy, shot in a dark basement with concrete walls. And there, tied to a chair in the center of the frame, was his mother. Her mouth was taped shut. Her eyes were wide with terror. A man's voice spoke in Spanish, cold and mechanical. "You have 48 hours to kill Mateo Ruiz. If you don't, your mother dies." No negotiations. No second chances. Woo Jin's hands went numb. The phone slipped from his grip and clattered onto the table. His lawyers stopped talking. They saw his face and knew something had gone very, very wrong. He didn't say a word. He just stood up, walked out of the room, and drove home faster than he ever had in his life. By the time he reached the mansion, his mind was already made. The Sinaloa cartel had crossed a line no one came back from. They wanted blood? He'd give them a notion of it. He'd burn their entire operation to the ground, starting with every safe house, every distributor, every person who had ever said the name Hector Ruiz out loud. He didn't care about the consequences. Didn't care if it started a war. They had taken his mother. And for that, they would all die. He went straight to the armory in the basement, a room Margaret had never seen and never would. Rows of rifles lined the walls. Pistols. Grenades. Everything he needed to paint Los Angeles red. He grabbed an AR-15 and started loading magazines, his hands moving on autopilot. His jaw was clenched so tight his teeth ached. His vision had narrowed to a single, burning point: revenge. That's when Margaret walked in. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her hands gripping the frame like she might collapse. Wu Jin. What are you doing? They took my mother, he said, not looking up. I'm getting her back. By doing what? Starting a massacre. If that's what it takes. He slammed another magazine into place, the metal clicking like a countdown. They want to see what happens when you push me too far. I'll show them. Margaret took a step forward, and that's when he saw it. Her legs were shaking. Not from fear. From exhaustion. From something much worse. She opened her mouth to speak, but instead, her knees buckled. Wu Jin dropped the rifle and caught her before she hit the ground. Margaret. His voice cracked. What's wrong? What's happening? She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. And for the first time since he'd met her, she looked small. Fragile. Breakable. I'm dying, Wu Jin. The words didn't make sense. He stared at her, waiting for the punchline, waiting for her to tell him this was some kind of joke. But she just kept crying, her body trembling in his arms. I have stage 4 glioblastoma. Brain cancer. The doctors gave me 6 months. Maybe less. Wu Jin's entire world stopped. The rifle. The cartel. His mother. Everything disappeared except the woman in his arms. No. No, that's not. Why didn't you tell me? Because I knew you'd do this. Her voice broke. I knew you'd go back to being the man you were trying to leave behind. And I couldn't let that happen. Not for me. You're dying, and you didn't think I deserved to know. His hands were shaking now, gripping her shoulders like she might vanish if he let go. How long have you known? 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She had been carrying this secret for 3 weeks. Smiling. Planning a wedding. Pretending everything was fine. And he had been too blind to see it. Too focused on his own plans. Too stupid to notice that the woman he loved was dying right in front of him. I can't lose you, he whispered, his voice cracking. I can't lose both of you. Margaret reached up and touched his face, her fingers cold against his skin. Then don't become a monster trying to save me. If I only have months left, I don't want to spend them watching you turn back into the man you hate. I want to spend them with a man I fell in love with. Wu Jin's chest felt like it was caving in. The weight of it, his mother kidnapped, Margaret dying, the cartel waiting for him to make a move, it was too much. He wanted to scream. He wanted to put a bullet in every person who had ever hurt the people he loved. But Margaret was right. If he went down that path, he'd lose himself. And she'd die knowing she couldn't save him. What do I do? His voice was barely a whisper. How do I fix this? You be the smart man your father wanted, Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tears. Not a blunt weapon. Not a killer. You outthink them. You find a way to get your mother back without losing your soul. Because if you don't, the cartel wins. They don't just take your mother, they take you too. Wu Jin looked down at the rifle on the floor, then back at Margaret. And for the first time in his life, he made a choice that didn't involve violence. He stood up, helped Margaret to the couch, and pulled out his phone. Not to call his men. Not to organize an attack. But to call the one person who might be able to help him negotiate his way out of this nightmare. Because Margaret was right. The cartel didn't just want his mother dead. They wanted him broken. And the only way to win was to refuse to break. But as he dialed the number, one thought burned in the back of his mind. Even if he saved his mother, even if he outsmarted the cartel, he was still going to lose Margaret. And that was a war he had no idea how to fight. Wu Jin walked into the warehouse alone. No guards. No weapons. Just a briefcase and a confidence he didn't fully feel. The building smelled like rust and old oil, and every footstep echoed off the concrete walls like a countdown. Hector Ruiz sat at a metal table in the center of the room, flanked by 6 armed men. He was older than Wu Jin expected, gray hair, deep lines around his eyes, the kind of face that had seen too much death to be impressed by threats. You're either very brave or very stupid, Hector said, leaning back in his chair. Coming here without an army. I'm neither, Wu Jin said, setting the briefcase on the table. I'm just tired of playing a game I never wanted to be in. Hector raised an eyebrow. So you're surrendering? I'm offering you a deal. Wu Jin opened the briefcase, revealing stacks of documents, property deeds, bank account numbers, shipping manifests. Everything I control. Every territory. Every money laundering route. I'm giving it all to you. In exchange, you release my mother and sign a protection agreement for her and Margaret. No retaliation. No revenge. You leave them alone, and I walk away." Hector laughed. It was a low, ugly sound that made Wu Jin's jaw tighten. "You think I'm stupid? The second I let you walk, you'll rebuild. You'll come back with twice the army and burn my operation to the ground." "No," Wu Jin said, his voice flat. "I won't. Because I've already cleaned the roots." Hector stopped laughing. "What?" "Every single business you're about to inherit is now legitimate. Community centers. Scholarships. Housing projects. The money laundering routes. Gone. I've rerouted everything through legal channels. The police can't touch them because there's nothing illegal left. Which means if you want to keep using them, you'll have to keep them clean. And if you try to dirty them again, the FBI will be waiting." Hector's face darkened. "You're bluffing." Wu Jin pulled out his phone and set it on the table. "I have a dead man's switch. If I don't check in every 12 hours, every financial record of your operation gets sent to the FBI. Bank accounts. Shell companies. Every politician you've ever bribed. Everything. So if you kill me, you lose everything. If you kill my mother or Margaret, you lose everything. The only way you win is if you take the deal and let me walk." The room went silent. Hector's men shifted uncomfortably, hands hovering near their weapons. But Hector just stared at Wu Jin, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "You're willing to give up everything? Your father's empire? Your legacy? For what? A dying woman and an old lady?" "Yes," Wu Jin said, his voice cracking. "Because they're the only thing I've ever cared about that wasn't built on blood." Hector studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're not like your father. He would have burned this warehouse to the ground and danced in the ashes." "I know," Wu Jin said. "That's why I'm still alive." Hector reached into his jacket, and Wu Jin's entire body tensed. But instead of a gun, Hector pulled out a pen. He signed the protection agreement and slid it across the table. "You have a deal. But if I ever see you in this business again, the agreement is void. Understood?" "Understood." 2 hours later, Wu Jin's mother was released at a gas station on the edge of the city. She was shaking, her clothes dirty, but unharmed. Wu Jin wrapped his arms around her and held on like he was afraid she'd disappear. She couldn't speak, couldn't tell him what they'd done to her, but she held on to him with a strength that told him everything he needed to know. She had survived because she believed he would come for her. He drove her home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He had won. He had outsmarted the cartel, saved his mother, and walked away without firing a single shot. But the victory felt hollow. Because waiting for him at home was Margaret, and no amount of strategy or money or power could save her. When he walked through the door, Margaret was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. She looked smaller than she had that morning. Paler. Like the life was draining out of her one drop at a time. But when she saw his mother, she smiled. That same bright, unbreakable smile she'd had the night they met. "You did it," she whispered. "I did," Wu Jin said, his voice thick. "I chose the light. Just like you asked." Margaret stood up slowly, her legs shaking, and walked over to his mother. She took the old woman's hand and squeezed it gently. "Welcome home." Wu Jin's mother looked at Margaret, then at him, and for the first time in weeks, there was peace in her eyes. She didn't know about Margaret's diagnosis. Didn't know that the woman who had saved her life twice was dying. And Wu Jin couldn't bring himself to tell her. Not yet. That night, the three of them sat together in the living room. Wu Jin's mother fell asleep in her chair, exhausted but safe. Margaret leaned against Wu Jin's shoulder, her breathing shallow. He wrapped his arm around her, feeling the sharp edges of her ribs through her sweater. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "Don't," Wu Jin said, his voice breaking. "Don't talk like this is the end." "It is, though." She looked up at him, her eyes wet but clear. "And that's okay. Because you proved something tonight. You proved you're not your father. You proved you can choose light over darkness. And that's all I ever wanted." Wu Jin didn't respond. Because what could he say? That he'd trade every victory, every ounce of peace, every good deed he'd ever done, just to have one more year with her? That the thought of losing her made him want to go back to that warehouse and burn it down after all? They sat in silence, the clock on the wall ticking louder than it ever had before. Wu Jin had saved his mother. He had outsmarted the cartel. He had become the man Margaret believed he could be. But none of it mattered. Because time was the one enemy he couldn't negotiate with. And it was already running out. The rain started just as the guests began to arrive. Not a storm, just a soft, steady drizzle that turned the garden into something out of a dream. White chairs lined the grass, and strings of lights hung from the trees, glowing against the grey sky. Wu Jin stood at the altar, his hand shaking as he watched Margaret being wheeled down the aisle. She wore a white dress that hung loose on her frame. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. But she was smiling. That same unbreakable smile she'd had the night they met. And for a moment, Wu Jin forgot she was dying. For a moment, she was just the woman he loved, walking toward him through the rain. His mother sat in the front row, gripping the armrests of her wheelchair. When Margaret passed, the old woman reached out and took her hand. Margaret stopped, leaning down to press her forehead against his mother's. They stayed like that for a long moment, two people who had saved each other in ways words could never capture. When Margaret finally pulled away, Wu Jin saw tears streaming down his mother's face. The officiant was a retired pastor Wu Jin had found through one of the community centers he'd funded. The man's voice was warm and steady as he began the ceremony, but Wu Jin barely heard him. All he could see was Margaret, sitting in that wheelchair, her hands folded in her lap, her breathing shallow but her gaze locked on his. "Do you have vows?" the pastor asked. Wu Jin nodded. He had written them a dozen times, each version feeling more inadequate than the last. But when he opened his mouth, the words came out raw and unfiltered. "Margaret, you found me in the rain. You carried my mother when no one else would. And you carried me when I didn't think I deserved to be saved. I spent my whole life choosing darkness because I thought that's what strength looked like. But you showed me that real strength is choosing light. Every single day. Even when it's hard. Even when it hurts. So I promise you, for however many days we have left, I will choose the light. I will choose you. Always." His voice cracked on the last word, and tears spilled down his cheeks. He didn't care who saw. Didn't care that his men were standing in the back row, watching their boss fall apart. Because this wasn't about being strong. This was about being honest. Margaret reached up and wiped his tears with her thumb. "Wu Jin, the night I met you, I thought I was saving your mother. But really, I was saving you. And you saved me right back. You gave me a reason to believe that broken people can still build something beautiful. So I promise you, for however many days I have left, I will love you with everything I am. And when I'm gone, I need you to keep choosing the light. Not for me. For you. Because that's the only way this matters." Her voice broke, and she had to stop. Wu Jin knelt beside her wheelchair, taking her hands in his. They were cold and fragile, and he held them like they were made of glass. The pastor cleared his throat. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Wu Jin slid the ring onto Margaret's finger, and she slid one onto his. And when they kissed, the rain fell harder, soaking them both. But neither of them pulled away. Because this moment, this single, perfect moment, was all they had. And they weren't going to waste a second of it. The reception was small. A handful of people Margaret had worked with at the diner. A few of Wu Jin's men who had watched him transform from a monster into something gentler. His mother sat in the center of it all, holding Margaret's hand like she was afraid to let go. And when the music started, Wu Jin stood and offered Margaret his hand. "I can't dance," she said, her voice weak. "I know," Wu Jin said. "So I'll dance for both of us." He lifted her out of the wheelchair, carrying her weight the way she had carried his mother's that first night. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her head resting against his chest, and they swayed slowly to the music. Her breathing was shallow, and he could feel her ribs pressing against him, but she was smiling. And that was enough. When the song ended, Margaret reached into a pocket sewn into her dress and pulled out a small wooden box. She pressed it into his hand. "Don't open it now," she whispered. "Open it when the sun sets. Promise me." "I promise." She kissed him one more time, and then he carried her back to the wheelchair. The guests started to leave, one by one, until it was just Wu Jin, Margaret, and his mother sitting in the garden as the rain turned to mist. The lights above them flickered softly, casting shadows across the wet grass. Wu Jin looked down at the box in his hand. He wanted to open it. Wanted to know what she had left him. But he had promised. So he slipped it into his pocket and sat beside her, holding her hand as the sky darkened and the last of the light faded from the world. They had won. They had built something beautiful out of the wreckage of their lives. But the clock was still ticking. And no amount of love, no amount of light, could stop what was coming. 3 months after the wedding, the house stopped feeling like a home. It became something quieter. Something heavier. Wu Jin converted the downstairs guest room into a hospital suite, medical bed, for stands, oxygen tanks. Margaret spent most of her days there now, too weak to move, her body shrinking under white sheets that seemed to swallow her whole. The tumor had taken her speech first, then her ability to eat, then her ability to stay awake for more than an hour at a time. Wu Jin never left her side. He slept in a chair next to her bed, waking every few hours to check her breathing. He read to her from books she used to love, novels about people who got happy endings, stories where love conquered everything. His voice would crack on certain lines, the ones about forever, the ones about growing old together. But he kept reading. Because as long as he was reading, she was still here. Still listening. Still fighting. His mother sat with them during the day, holding Margaret's hand, humming old Korean lullabies that Margaret couldn't hear anymore. The old woman didn't understand what was happening, didn't understand why the girl who had carried her through the rain was fading away. But she knew enough to stay. To be present. To refuse to let Margaret face the darkness alone. One morning, Wu Jin woke to the sound of Margaret's breathing changing. It was slower. Shallower. Like her body was forgetting how to do the thing it had done automatically for 27 years. He sat up, his heart pounding, and leaned over her. Margaret. Her eyes fluttered open. For the first time in weeks, they were clear. Focused. Like she had clawed her way back from wherever the tumor had taken her just to see him one more time. Her lips moved, and Wu Jin leaned closer, his ear inches from her mouth. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice so faint he almost didn't hear it. "For making my last year a lifetime." Wu Jin's chest caved in. He wanted to tell her not to say goodbye. Wanted to beg her to stay. Wanted to scream at the universe for being cruel enough to give him everything he'd ever wanted just to rip it away. But instead, he kissed her forehead and whispered back, "I love you. I love you so much it hurts." She smiled. That same unbreakable smile. And then her eyes drifted shut. The sun rose an hour later, painting the garden outside in shades of gold and pink. The flowers Margaret had planted 3 months ago were in full bloom. Roses, lavender, jasmine. She had insisted on planting them herself, even when she could barely stand, saying she wanted to leave something beautiful behind. Wu Jin watched the light spill across her face, and he knew, without checking her pulse, without calling the doctor, that she was gone. He sat there for a long time, holding her hand. It was still warm at first, but slowly, it turned cold. And Wu Jin realized that this was it. This was the moment he had been dreading since the night she told him she was dying. The moment when the world kept spinning, and she wasn't in it anymore. His mother wheeled herself into the room an hour later. She looked at Margaret, then at Wu Jin, and something in her expression broke. She reached out and took Wu Jin's free hand, squeezing it with a strength she shouldn't have had. And together, they sat in the silence, mourning the woman who had saved them both. The funeral was held a week later in the same garden where they had gotten married. Wu Jin expected a handful of people, maybe the staff from the diner, maybe a few distant relatives Margaret never talked about. But when he walked outside, he saw hundreds of people. Families from the community centers he'd funded. Kids who had received scholarships in Margaret's name. Nurses who had cared for her in her final days. People whose lives had been touched by the foundation he'd built in her honor. A woman Wu Jin didn't recognize walked up to him, tears streaming down her face. "Your wife paid for my daughter's cancer treatment," she said, her voice shaking. "We couldn't afford it. We were going to lose her. But Margaret found out and covered everything. She saved my baby's life." Wu Jin nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He hadn't known about that. Margaret had never told him. She had just quietly used the money from the foundation to save people, one life at a time, without asking for credit or recognition. That was who she was. A woman who believed that kindness didn't need an audience. After the service, Wu Jin stood alone at her grave. His mother sat beside him in her wheelchair, staring at the headstone like she was trying to memorize it. Wu Jin pulled out the wooden box Margaret had given him on their wedding day. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside was a letter, folded neatly, and a USB drive. He unfolded the letter, and Margaret's handwriting stared back at him, messy, rushed, like she had written it in the middle of the night when she couldn't sleep. Wu Jin, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I need you to know something, you are not a monster. You never were. Monsters don't cry when they hold dying women. Monsters don't build community centers and scholarship funds. Monsters don't choose light when darkness is easier. The USB drive has all the video letters I recorded for you. Watch them when you're ready. Not all at once. Just when you need to remember that I believed in you. Don't let them forget that monsters can choose to be heroes. Don't let them forget that a boy born into blood and violence can grow into a man who plants gardens. That's your story. That's your legacy. And please, Wu Jin, don't stop choosing the light. Even when it hurts. Even when I'm not there to remind you. Because that's the only way this mattered. That's the only way I can rest. I love you. Always. Margaret. Wu Jin's vision blurred. He folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the box. Then he looked down at the grave, at the flowers already starting to wilt in the sun, and made a promise. I won't stop, he whispered. I won't go back. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure people know your name. Making sure they know what you did. What you gave. I'll keep choosing the light. For you. For my mother. For everyone you saved. His mother reached up and squeezed his hand. She couldn't speak, but her grip said everything. She's proud of you. And so am I. Wu Jin stood there until the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden. The guests had left. The flowers had been placed. And Margaret was gone. But the world she had changed, the world she had forced him to help build, was still here. Still growing. Still blooming. And that, Wu Jin realized, was the only kind of forever that mattered. 30 years later, Wu Jin's hair had turned silver. His hands moved slower now, his knees ached when he climbed stairs, and the dragon tattoo on his back had faded to a dull gray. But his eyes still carried the weight of everything he had lost and everything he had built because of it. He stood at the entrance of the Margaret Park Community Center, staring at the bronze letters above the door, and felt the familiar tightness in his chest that never really went away. His son, David, stood beside him. 28 years old, a doctor at the free clinic 2 blocks away. He had Margaret's smile, the kind that made strangers feel safe. Wu Jin's daughter, Grace, stood on his other side. 26, a lawyer who spent her days fighting corrupt institutions that preyed on the vulnerable. She had her mother's fire, the kind that didn't back down even when the world tried to crush her. You ready, Dad? David asked, his hand resting gently on Wu Jin's shoulder. Wu Jin nodded, but he wasn't sure if that was true. He hadn't been back here in months. Every time he walked through these doors, he saw her. Not the Margaret who had wasted away in that hospital bed, but the Margaret who had carried his mother through the rain. The Margaret who had smiled at him across a table in that tiny Thai restaurant and told him life was too short to be someone you hate. They walked inside together. The center was alive. Children running through the halls, families sitting in the common room, volunteers handing out meals. Everything was free. Health care. Legal aid. Job training. Child care. Wu Jin had spent 3 decades pouring every dollar he had into this place, making sure no one ever had to choose between eating and paying rent. Making sure no one ever felt as helpless as he had the night his mother was abandoned in the rain. Grace led him through the main hall toward the back garden. And there, in the center of the space, stood a bronze statue. A woman carrying an elderly person on her back, her face turned upward, rain falling around her. The plaque at the base read, Margaret Park, she carried us all. Wu Jin stopped in front of it, his throat burning. He came here every year on the anniversary of her death, but it never got easier. The statue captured her perfectly, the determination in her posture, the gentleness in the way she held his mother. But it couldn't capture her laugh. It couldn't capture the way she had looked at him like he was worth saving. We've shut down the last one, Grace said quietly, standing beside him. The last corrupt nursing home in the city. The board tried to fight us, but we had too much evidence. They're done. Wu Jin's hands trembled. It had taken 30 years, but they had finally done it. Every facility that had neglected vulnerable people, every corporation that had profited off suffering, they were gone. Replaced by centers like this one. Places where people were treated like they mattered. She would have been proud, David said, his voice thick. Wu Jin nodded, but he couldn't speak. Because the truth was, he didn't know if Margaret would have been proud. He had spent 30 years trying to be the man she believed he could be. But some days, he still felt like the monster in the boardroom with a gun under the table. Some days, he still heard Hector's voice in his head, reminding him that walking away didn't erase what he had been. But then he looked at his children, 2 people who had grown up knowing nothing about the violence that had defined his early life. 2 people who had dedicated their lives to helping others because that's what their mother's legacy had taught them. And he realized, Margaret hadn't just saved him. She had saved the entire bloodline. He sat down on a memorial bench near the statue, watching families play in the park. A little girl chased her brother through the garden, laughing so hard she could barely breathe. An elderly man sat under a tree, reading a book in the shade. A young mother pushed a stroller, her face calm and unburdened. This was the world Margaret had fought for. The world she had forced Wu Jin to help build. And it was still here, 30 years later, because she had refused to let him stay in the darkness. Wu Jin pulled out his phone. The screen was cracked, the battery barely held a charge anymore, but he kept it because it was the only device that still had Margaret's videos. He scrolled to the last one, the one he had only watched once, the night of her funeral, because it hurt too much to hear her voice. But today, for some reason, he needed to hear it again. He pressed play. Margaret's face filled the screen. She looked so young in the video, 27, her skin still healthy, her eyes still bright. She was sitting in the guest house, wrapped in a blanket, and she was smiling. Not the tired, painful smile from her final days. The real one. The unbreakable one. "Hey, Wu Jin," she said, her voice clear and warm. "If you're watching this, I've been gone for a while. And I hope, God, I really hope, you didn't spend the last however many years hating yourself. Because that's not what this was about. This was about proving that people can change. That monsters can become heroes. That a man born into violence can choose to plant gardens instead of graves." She paused, wiping her eyes. "I don't know what the world looks like where you are now. But I hope it's better. I hope you kept your promise. I hope you're still choosing the light, even when it's hard. Even when I'm not there to remind you. Because that's the only way this meant something." Her voice cracked, and she had to stop for a moment. When she spoke again, she was crying. "I love you, Wu Jin. I love you so much it breaks my heart that I won't get to see the man you become. But I know, you're going to be amazing. You're going to change lives. You're going to prove that love is stronger than fear. And one day, when you're old and grey and sitting in some garden surrounded by people you've helped, I want you to look up at the sky and know, I'm there. I'm watching. And I'm so proud of you." The video ended. Wu Jin sat there, tears streaming down his face, his chest heaving with the weight of 30 years of grief. He looked up at the sky, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, and for the first time in a long time, he felt her. Not as a memory. Not as a ghost. But as a presence. A force. A reminder that he had kept his promise. "We're living the life you gave us, my love," he whispered to the air. David and Grace walked over, each placing a hand on his shoulder. They didn't say anything. They didn't need to. Because they understood. They had grown up hearing stories about the woman who had saved their father. The woman who had turned a monster into a man. And they had spent their entire lives continuing her work, making sure her name was never forgotten. Wu Jin stood slowly, his knees protesting, and looked back at the statue one more time. The bronze woman stared back at him, frozen in the rain, carrying a burden that wasn't hers but choosing to carry it anyway. And Wu Jin realized, that's what love was. Not grand gestures or perfect moments. Just the quiet, stubborn refusal to let someone face the storm alone. He turned and walked toward his children, his family, his legacy. A man who had been born into blood and violence. A man who had inherited a throne of fear. But also a man who had met a waitress in the rain and learned that monsters could choose to be heroes. And in the end, that choice, that single, impossible choice, had been enough to change the world.